You know that feeling when a song comes on and suddenly you're back. Back in a car with the windows down, back in a room full of people you haven't seen in decades. The 70s had hundreds of songs like that, but somewhere along the way, radio decided to forget most of them. Today, we're bringing them back. These are the 15 forgotten 70s rock songs modern radio pretends never happened. Number 15, Candy's Going Bad by Golden Earring. Most people know Golden Earring from Radar Love, the Dutch band's relentless hypnotic highway anthem that became a staple of American radio in 1973. But Radar Love was only one track on the Moontan album, and what surrounds it on that record is every bit as strong. Candy's Going Bad opens the album with a grinding, blues-drenched riff and a swagger that sounds like it came straight out of the Rolling Stones playbook, but rougher, more urgent, less polished. Golden Earring had been recording since the mid-1960s, and by the time Moontan came out in 1973, they were already on their 9th studio album. American radio took Radar Love and decided that was enough. The rest of the record, including the sprawling, atmospheric tracks that filled both sides of the original vinyl, was left completely alone. In their native Netherlands, the band had been putting out hits for nearly a decade. In America, they were essentially treated as a one-song act. Candy's Going Bad is one of the best opening tracks of that entire decade, and most people who weren't flipping through import bins in 1973 have never heard it. It sets the tone for an album that rewards full front-to-back listening, something radio has never been particularly interested in encouraging. Number 14, Bridge of Sighs by Robin Trower. Robin Trower left Procol Harum in 1971 after years of contributing to a band that, as he put it, didn't leave enough room for the direction his guitar playing was heading. He wanted a power trio. He wanted the guitar to be the center of everything. After a brief and unsuccessful stint with a group called Jude, he paired up with vocalist and bassist James Dewar and drummer Reg Isidore, signed to Chrysalis Records, and released his debut solo album in early 1973. That album built a cult following, but it was his second record, Bridge of Sighs, released in 1974, that showed what the trio was truly capable of. The title track is a slow, heavy, deeply atmospheric piece that sits in the space between blues and something harder to define. Trower's guitar tone, built around a Univibe effect and Marshall amplifiers, had a quality that was unmistakably his own. There were comparisons to Jimi Hendrix's influence from the beginning, and Trower had openly acknowledged that Hendrix's playing had changed the way he approached the instrument. Bridge of Sighs reached number 7 on the Billboard 200 and sold over 1.5 million copies, making it his commercial high point. Trower spent the rest of the decade releasing a series of albums that kept a devoted audience listening, while radio looked almost entirely the other way. The title track has essentially vanished from mainstream rotation. Guitarists know it well. Everyone else has largely forgotten it was ever there. Number 13, The Band Plays On by Backstreet Crawler. Paul Kossoff was the guitarist for Free, the British band that gave the world All Right Now, one of the most economical, perfectly structured rock songs ever recorded. What fewer people talk about is what came after Free finally disbanded in 1973. Kossoff formed a new group, Backstreet Crawler, named after a solo album he had released that same year. The band's 1975 debut, The Band Plays On, carried the same DNA as Free's best work, a stripped-down, blues-rooted approach where every note was chosen with care, and Kossoff's wide, expressive vibrato remained the central voice. The problem was that Kossoff had been battling serious health issues for years, the result of prolonged drug dependency that had caused repeated physical crises. In June 1975, he was hospitalized mid-tour following a drug-related seizure and suffered a cardiac arrest while receiving treatment. He recovered enough to continue working, but only just. A second album, Second Street, was recorded with significant assistance from session players to cover for what Kossoff could no longer reliably deliver on his own. On March 19, 1976, on a flight from Los Angeles to New York during an American tour with the band, Paul Kossoff died from a pulmonary embolism. He was 25 years old. The music he left behind on The Band Plays On is among the most genuinely affecting rock of that decade. Raw, soulful, and played by someone who clearly had nothing left to prove and everything left to give. Number 12, Easy Street by the Edgar Winter Group. The Edgar Winter Group arrived with They Only Come Out at Night, released in November 1972, an album that produced two of the decade's most memorable rock moments, the instrumental Frankenstein, which reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in the spring of 1973, and Free Ride. The success of that record gave Edgar Winter a commercial platform he had never had before. The follow-up, Shock Treatment, came out in 1974, with guitarist Rick Derringer now taking a more prominent role in both production and performance. The album opened with Easy Street, a track that leaned into Edgar Winter's strengths as a vocalist and multi-instrumentalist, keyboards, saxophone, and a deep knowledge of the blues running underneath everything he played. The arrangement was looser and more relaxed than anything on the previous record, and Derringer's guitar work gave it an edge that matched the stripped-back feel. Shock Treatment didn't come close to repeating the commercial success of its predecessor, and radio moved on almost immediately after it appeared. Edgar Winter's catalog beyond the two big hits from 1973 has remained essentially invisible to mainstream audiences ever since. He continued making music through the rest of the decade and beyond, but the window that Frankenstein had opened closed quickly and never fully reopened. Number 11, Rock and Roll, Hoochie Coo by Rick Derringer. Rick Derringer wrote Rock and Roll Hoochie Coo for Johnny Winter in 1970, and Winter recorded it for the Johnny Winter an album that year. 3 years later, Derringer put out his own version on his 1973 solo debut, All American Boy, and the single climbed to number 23 on the Billboard Hot 100, his highest charting record as a solo artist. Derringer had already been working as a producer and session guitarist for years by that point, contributing to records by Johnny and Edgar Winter, Steely Dan, Todd Rundgren, and a long list of others. He was one of those musicians who was quietly involved in a remarkable amount of what was happening in rock during the early to mid-70s without ever becoming a household name himself. Rock and Roll Hoochie Coo is straight-ahead, unadorned rock and roll at its most direct, a riff-driven song with the kind of structural simplicity that is considerably harder to pull off convincingly than it looks. It charted, received some play, and then gradually disappeared from rotation as the decade moved on. Derringer's catalog as a whole has never received the attention it warranted, and the song he wrote more than 50 years ago deserved a considerably longer run on the airwaves. Rick Derringer passed away in May 2025. Number 10, Statesboro Blues by the Allman Brothers Band. Wake up, mama! Turn your lamp down. The Allman Brothers Band recorded Statesboro Blues for their 1971 live album at Fillmore East. which remains one of the finest live rock recordings ever made. The song itself was not original to the band. It was written by Georgia bluesman Blind Willie McTell in 1928 and had been recorded many times over the decades before the Allmans got to it. But what Duane Allman did with his slide guitar on the Fillmore version turned it into something genuinely new. The interplay between Allman and Dickie Betts and the way the track builds through the band's collective improvisation made it one of the defining moments on an album full of them. At Fillmore East sold well and received immediate critical recognition, and the Allman Brothers built one of the most devoted followings in American rock during the early part of that decade. The band's music carried the tradition of Southern blues and rock in a direction that no one else was taking quite so directly. Statesboro Blues, however, never got the radio rotation that Ramblin' Man and Midnight Rider received. It became a song that people who had worn out their copy of the live album treasured while the wider public stayed largely unaware of what they were missing. For anyone who grew up in the South in the early 70s, it was a touchstone. For everyone else, radio made sure it stayed a stranger. Number 9, Slow Ride by Foghat. Foghat formed in 1971 from the wreckage of Savoy Brown, a British blues rock band that had been grinding away on the touring circuit since the late 1960s. The core of Foghat, guitarist Dave Peverett, bassist Tony Stevens, and drummer Roger Earl, brought that same relentless work ethic to their new band, spending most of the early 70s on the road and building a following through constant live performance rather than radio support. Slow Ride, from their 1975 album Fool for the City, was one of their biggest commercial moments. It charted and received some airplay, but the version that actually captures what Foghat was about is the full album cut, which runs well over 8 minutes and builds through a long, hypnotic groove that demands the kind of patient listening that commercial radio has never been particularly good at accommodating. Foghat was a band that radio was happy to benefit from. They sold tickets, they filled arenas, they brought people to music in a genuine way, but not especially committed to supporting. The stations took the audience and left the catalog alone. Slow Ride has been largely absent from mainstream rotation for decades, which is a strange fate for a song that was built, note for note, for the open road. Number 8, Feelin' All Right by Joe Cocker. Feelin' All Right was written by Dave Mason and first appeared on the Traffic album Traffic in 1968. Joe Cocker recorded his own version for his debut album the following year, and by 1970, it had become one of the most electrifying live pieces in his repertoire, particularly after his performance at Woodstock in the summer of 1969 in front of hundreds of thousands of people. Cocker's approach to the song, the ragged, soulful vocal, the gospel-influenced arrangement built around his band Grease Band, stripped away the more polished feel of the original and replaced it with something that sounded genuinely urgent and uncontrolled in the best possible way. Through the 70s, Cocker continued recording and touring, releasing a series of albums that received varying levels of attention and commercial success. His voice was one of the most distinctive in rock during that period, rough, impassioned, and capable of turning any song into something personal. But Feelin' All Right, one of the performances that had originally established him, gradually disappeared from regular airplay. By the time he had a commercial resurgence in 1983 with the duet Up Where We Belong, radio had long since moved on from the raw energy of his earlier work. That energy is still on the record, exactly as it was left. It just stopped being something radio felt it needed to play. Number 7, Rock Me Baby by B.B. King.
Till I want no more.
B.B. King had been one of the defining figures in American blues since the late 1940s, but the early 1970s brought him a new and substantially younger audience through the blues revival that was running through rock music on both sides of the Atlantic. Rock Me Baby was a song he had recorded multiple times going back to the 1950s, a standard in his live set that he had made so thoroughly his own that the specific quality of his guitar tone and his vocal phrasing had become inseparable from the song itself. His 1971 album Live in Cook County Jail, recorded at the Cook County Jail in Chicago in September 1970, gave the song a remarkable new setting. The recording documented a concert that was direct and unguarded, King playing to an audience of inmates with the kind of honesty and commitment that studio recordings can rarely capture in the same way. The album became one of the most praised live blues recordings of its era and helped expand King's audience considerably. Rock radio of the 70s occasionally dipped into blues-influenced material, particularly when an artist had a rock band framing. But B.B. King's catalog, even at its most immediate and accessible, was largely confined to specialist programming and blues format stations. The crossover radio play that his music warranted never fully materialized, and Live in Cook County Jail remains far less known outside blues circles than it has any right to be. Number 6, Sail Away by Randy Newman.
Everybody is as happy as me.
Randy Newman released Sail Away as the title track of his 1972 album, and it earned him the kind of response that had become familiar by then: widespread admiration from critics and fellow musicians. Almost no commercial radio play. Newman had a sardonic and deeply literary approach to songwriting that operated on layers most radio programmers were not interested in navigating. His songs were built to be listened to carefully, and they didn't offer much to anyone looking for background noise.
Sail away.
Sail Away is constructed around a deceptively gentle piano arrangement, and the perspective it's written from is one that requires full engagement to understand. It is the kind of writing that rewards patience and close attention, and exactly the kind of writing that commercial radio didn't know what to do with. Newman spent most of the decade being described as a songwriter's songwriter, which is generally a polite way of acknowledging that the mainstream had made its position clear. He built a small but intensely committed audience, continued making records that critics treated with genuine respect, and watched radio keep its distance throughout. The album and the title track hold up as well today as anything recorded in that decade.
Charleston Bay.
Number 5, Evil Woman by Electric Light Orchestra.
You better fool of me.
The Electric Light Orchestra were one of the more commercially successful acts of the mid to late 70s, and Jeff Lynne's production work during that period represents one of the decade's most distinctive sounds: dense string arrangements, layered vocals, and a pop instinct disciplined enough to hold all of it together. Evil Woman, from the 1975 album Face the Music, was one of their bigger singles, reaching number 10 on the Billboard Hot 100 and standing as a clear example of the sound Lynne had been building toward since ELO's formation in 1970. The song was a genuine chart success at the time, but as the decade turned and the band's profile continued to grow, and as tracks like Mr. Blue Sky and Don't Bring Me Down became permanent fixtures of classic rock radio, Evil Woman quietly dropped out of rotation. It has been largely absent from mainstream airplay for the better part of 4 decades now. Face the Music as an album has been even more thoroughly forgotten, which is a particular shame, because it represents the moment when ELO fully found their footing as a band and as a studio force. The audience they built in the years that followed owed a significant debt to what that album established. Number 4, Baby I Love Your Way by Peter Frampton.
Wanna tell you I love your way.
Peter Frampton had been a working musician since the mid-1960s, a member of the Herd, then co-founder of Humble Pie, then a solo artist who spent the early 70s building a following without ever quite breaking through commercially. Baby I Love Your Way appeared on his 1975 studio album Frampton, a thoughtfully made record that received modest attention and built on the audience he had been developing through years of relentless touring. Then, Frampton Comes Alive was released in January 1976, and everything changed almost overnight. The live version of Baby I Love Your Way from that record became one of the year's defining songs, and the double live album went on to become one of the best-selling live albums in history. Through 1976 and into 1977, Frampton was one of the biggest names in rock. The fall, when it came, was rapid. The 1978 Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band film was a commercial and critical disaster, and radio's enthusiasm for Frampton cooled sharply in the aftermath. Today, Show Me the Way still surfaces occasionally on classic rock stations. Baby I Love Your Way, despite its enormous presence in 1976, has mostly disappeared from regular rotation. The studio version from Frampton has been even more completely forgotten. There is something genuinely strange about the speed at which radio abandoned a song that had been that widely heard. Number 3, Long May You Run by the Stills Young Band.
Some things together.
Neil Young and Stephen Stills had known each other since the formation of Buffalo Springfield in 1966, and their working relationship had continued through the various configurations of Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young over the following decade. In early 1976, after CSNY had once again stalled over internal tensions, Stills and Young decided to record an album together as a pair under the name the Stills Young Band. They worked at Criteria Studios in Miami, and the album, also titled Long May You Run, was released in September of that year. The title track was written by Young as a tribute to his 1948 Buick Roadmaster hearse, a vehicle he had named Mort and driven from Canada toward Los Angeles in the mid-1960s until it broke down for good in Blind River, Ontario. There is a quiet, unhurried warmth to the song that suits both its subject and the reflective mood Young was in at the time. The Stills Young Band tour ended abruptly when Young left by telegram after 19 dates, leaving Stills to honor the remaining shows alone. The album received some radio play at the time of its release, but it has since been almost entirely overshadowed by Young's extensive solo catalog, by the larger CSNY legacy, and simply by the way time tends to bury the records that don't fit neatly into a narrative. The title track is one of the most genuinely tender songs of that entire decade, and the fact that it has been so completely absorbed into the background is one of the harder things to explain about how rock radio sorted its priorities. Number 2, The Pusher by Steppenwolf. Steppenwolf's place in rock history is secured by 2 songs from 1968, Born to Be Wild and Magic Carpet Ride, both of which became permanent fixtures of classic rock radio and have never really left. Both songs earned that status honestly, but their version of The Pusher, written by Hoyt Axton and also recorded for their 1968 debut album, was something entirely different in tone and intention, slower, graver, and far more bluntly confrontational than either of those hits. It drew a clear and deliberate line between a dealer and what Axton called a pusher, treating the latter as something beyond redemption in plain and uncompromising terms. The song appeared in the 1969 film Easy Rider, which placed it directly at the center of the cultural conversation happening in America at that moment. The film, the music, and the mood were inseparable. The Pusher belonged to that intersection in a way that Born to Be Wild, which also appeared in the film, did not, because it dealt with consequence rather than freedom. While Born to Be Wild has never left the airwaves, the pusher faded almost entirely from radio. It belongs to a very specific and complicated moment in American life. One that classic rock radio, with its preference for celebration over confrontation, has never quite known how to accommodate. Number 1, Riders on the Storm by The Doors.
Into this world we're thrown.
The Doors recorded L.A. Woman in late 1970 and early 1971 after their longtime producer Paul Rothchild walked away from the sessions. Engineer Bruce Botnick stepped in, and the band recorded the album at their own rehearsal space in Los Angeles with a stripped-back approach that suited the material perfectly. Riders on the Storm was the final track on the record, and, as it turned out, the last song Jim Morrison ever recorded. The arrangement is sparse and deeply atmospheric. Fender Rhodes' electric piano, bass, brushed drums, and Morrison's vocal treated with a whispered overdub. He added himself during the mixing sessions to create an eerie, layered doubling effect. The rain and thunder woven into the track are actual recordings, not studio synthesis, and they give the whole piece a texture that is immediately unlike anything else in the Doors' catalog. L.A. Woman was released in April 1971. Morrison left for Paris shortly afterward and died there on July 3, 1971, at the age of 27. The single had entered the Billboard Hot 100 the very day he died and went on to peak at number 14. Over the following decades, Riders on the Storm has received sporadic airplay, but compared to Light My Fire and People Are Strange, it has been consistently underplayed by mainstream radio. For the final recording from one of rock's most mythologized figures, a song that carries the weight of everything that came after it without seeming to know what was coming, it deserves far more than it gets. These 15 songs were not forgotten because they weren't good enough. They were made by serious musicians at the height of their abilities, during a decade that produced some of the most adventurous and honest rock music ever put to tape. Radio made its choices, and most of these tracks weren't among them, but they are still there, on vinyl, on streaming platforms, exactly as they were left. If any of these brought back a memory, or introduced you to something you hadn't heard before, hit the like button and subscribe. There are more lists like this one coming, and each of them goes a little deeper into the music that time almost buried.